when you write a book, people think that you must be like one of the characters. That tends to be true when you're a comic book artist. You keep drawing yourself as a big, handsome superhero or, a beautiful flying lady, which I would totally do if I could draw. But when you write a novel, you're telling stories, and your characters come from all sorts of places. So I've met a bunch of people who assume I'm a pilot, because I wrote about Flygirl is about the Women's Air Force service pilots. Now, they were also a civilian group, but unlike Judy's group, and you said you were flying Piper Cubs, which are little two-seater planes. The Women's Air Force service pilots, they flew military planes. They were trained by the military to fly military planes to free up the men to go fight overseas. So some of the missions were the same, though. I think the Civil Air Patrol, you were patrolling the coast for Nazi submarines, which sounds crazy, Nazis off the coast of Connecticut. But it happened, right? A Nazi sub washed up on the coast of Florida. And the Civil Air Patrol did not fly weaponized planes. And so all they could do was say, hey, there are Nazis over there, do something about it. And by the time the military got itself together, the Nazis had shoved the submarine back into the water and gotten away. And I think after that, they actually did put some weapons on some of these little planes. But a Piper Cub is kind of the equivalent of a Cooper Mini in terms of to a car. So, you're not putting a bomb on a Cooper Mini. So I don't really know how effective a gun on a Piper would have been. But I'm not a pilot. I am not a pilot. I have flown in small planes. I've been terrified in small planes. I don't have that sort of, it takes a certain something to want to be a pilot. It takes even more to want to be a pilot in the middle of a war. So my invisible hat is off to you for your service, because that to me is incredible. So people are disappointed when they find out that I don't fly, and I go, but I wrote a book. For me, my story, I've been a writer for most of my life. I've been a bad writer for most of my life, and then you keep at it, and like anything, you get better. Riding a bicycle, one day your dad doesn't have to hold on to the back of it, and you can take off the training wheels, and there you are. So I've been writing most of my life, and I take my stories from all over the place. And for Flygirl in particular, what caught my attention was a documentary, a radio documentary. There's a group called Radio Stories, I think, and they do radio documentaries for National Public Radio. And I was sitting in traffic one day, because I could drive. I can't fly, but I could drive, which was also an ordeal, which is probably a good thing that I don't fly, because of the way I was so afraid of learning how to drive as a kid. I told my mother, I'm never going to drive, I'll have a horse, which, it didn't work out that way. But I was sitting in traffic, and I was listening to the radio, which you cannot do on a horse. So this documentary came on about the Women's Air Force service pilots, and it was interviews with some of the women, and old-timey music playing and newsreel footage. And one of the women, she said, we were all brought together. There were farm girls and heiresses all suddenly thrown together, living in the same dorms, and how it was this real mix of people who came at flying from different arenas. You learned to fly in the Civil Air Patrol. Some of these women were wealthy, and they had boyfriends that flew or husbands that flew and taught them. And some of them were just determined girls who were going to learn how to fly. Some were farmers' daughters who had learned in the family crop duster. And that really fascinated me, and particularly the idea of people who would never meet in any other circumstance, brought together by a skill, a love of that skill, and a war. And so the next day I was at work, and a friend of mine at work said, did you hear that radio documentary about the wasp? And I was like, I did. I've been thinking about it. And she said, I think that's going to be your next book. And I was like, I think you're right. But I really thought about it, and I didn't know what was going to make it a story that only I could tell. I think it's important to write. People say write what you know. I say write what you're interested in, because it takes a lot to write a novel, and you've got to be with it for the long haul. And I was fascinated by these women, because again, I don't want to be in a little plane. I don't know that I would sign up for that. But what was it about these women that would make them do it? And to let you know some of the difficulties the women faced in this program, the idea was to train them. And some of the jobs they would have were ferrying jobs. So when new planes were built for the war effort at a factory out in California, these women would fly them to Philadelphia so they could be shipped overseas to fight in the European theater of war. Sometimes they were flying just VIPs back and forth across the country for the war effort. Sometimes they were flying weather missions. Instead of sending up a weather balloon, you send up a woman in an airplane, and she would, get the lay of the land so they could plan things. Our women did not, for the most part, fly combat missions. People were already crazed by the idea of women flying military planes, flying any plane, let alone a military plane, but not combat. Whereas in England, there's a women's air force that did fly, for the Royal Air Force, they did fly some combat missions. And in Russia, there was a group of women that the Germans came to fear so much, they called them the night witches, because they would bomb the crap out of them at night. And very dangerous work, but valuable. And much like here in the States, the Women's Air Force Service pilots were not given any recognition for their work. Women in caps were not given any recognition for their work because they did all these dangerous things. Oh, my favorite dangerous mission is target towing. How do you teach someone to shoot a giant howitzer or some other kind of gun at air? How do you learn to shoot anti-aircraft? You shoot at an aircraft. So these women would fly these planes with a target attached to the tail wing. Like the signs we see over the beach these days, like, eat at Domino's. But it would be a target, and these guys would shoot at them. And sometimes these guys would shoot them and shoot them down because A, they're learning, which you don't want, and some of them were angry that women were flying planes and didn't think they should be and were trying to scare them. So that happened more than once, that a woman would be downed because another pilot, maybe a male pilot, would fly too close and waggle his wings and try to knock her out of the sky to teach her a lesson. But because they were not technically military, they had no military benefits. If a woman died in service, and I can't remember, about 100 of the WASP, there were 1,400 in all thereabouts, and about 100 of them did die either in training or in actual service. They were not given a military burial. They were, I heard another story on the radio, and it was a woman who had been a WASP, and she had never told anybody. And one day her daughter came to her and said, "Mom, I'm working on a documentary about these women pilots in World War II. Isn't that cool?" And she's like, "Oh, that was me. I was one of those people." What? So I'm so glad you know that what your mother was doing, what she was getting up to. That this woman had never told anybody, because when the war ended, all of the WASP were told to go home. And just pack up your bags and go home. These jobs are now for men. The men are back. You don't have to do this anymore. And a lot of women never flew again. And you never flew again. But the good news is he never drove a tank again. So her husband served in World War II under Patton. And what was it? Learned to drive a tank before he learned to drive a car. Watch out, guys, because he drove tonight. But so these women were sent home again, and so this woman had never told anybody that she had served, and so her daughter was like, "Why didn't you say anything?" And she assumed kids were learning about this in school. Who here had heard of the Women's Air Force Service pilots before tonight? Okay, that is, I don't know, that's less than a quarter of the people here. When I started writing Flygirl, I was in a grad school program, and I wrote the first draft as my master's thesis. And when I told my thesis professor, this is what I want to write about, he said, I served in World War II, and I've never heard about these women. And I was like, I better write this book, because come on. And so in this radio piece, I heard this woman, she started going to schools to talk about being a WASP because she said it's important. It's American history, it's women's history, and it's aviation history. And she was surprised that after she spoke, children came up and wanted to take their picture with her. And she felt like a hero. And the thing is, she was a hero. But one of the stories she told was at her graduation. So you train for so many weeks to fly, and you're taught to fly these planes. The women had to be better pilots than the men. You had to have a better safety record. You had to submit to tests every month or more, because they also had ideas about women being able to fly while they had cramps. If a woman can do everything else with cramps, she can fly. But, it was all of these things were questioned. We don't know. Well, maybe they get lightheaded up there. So they submitted to a lot, and then a lot of harassment. And don't get me started on the bathroom issue. Like, pilots have this little tube that they can use when it's like a guy stuck in traffic can always go in a bottle. A woman cannot. So the WASP kept maps of all the good bathrooms. This is what you should do if you're a long distance runner or jogger too. Know where all the good restrooms are that will let you use them, and so they could land and go. But it just lets you know how restrictive it was. We were just talking at dinner about, in the Senate, they finally have 100 women in the Senate for the first time ever, and how a couple of years ago they had to expand the bathrooms because they didn't have bathrooms for women. And it's like, think about it, guys, we're here, and we gotta go. The story this woman told was that when she graduated, one of the mothers of a girl who had died during training came to the graduation, and she stood up at the podium, much like I am, and she said, I want all of you to hear something. And she took out a telegram. She said, this is what I received when my daughter died. And it said, Dear Mrs. So-and-so, we regret to inform you that your daughter has died. You can collect the body here. Sincerely, Colonel so-and-so. That was it. Now, I know for a fact, I just went to a military funeral in Arlington, and you get the color guard, you get a 21-gun salute, you have a team of white horses pulling your coffin down to your grave, and at the end of it, one of the Arlington ladies, this little lady in white gloves, steps forward and gives you the flag from the coffin of your loved one and says, on behalf of the President of the United States and the United States Armed Forces, we thank you for your loved one's service. And this woman just got a telegram saying, you can pick up the body here. Women who flew in the WASP had to pay for their own funerals if they died. So sometimes the girls would get the money together to help out, because imagine you're the family of you're a daughter of a farmer. You don't necessarily have the money to go to Texas or California or wherever your child is and claim them. And that really struck me as not just how unjust the government was being and the world could be because they were women, but how very heroic these women were, because they knew all this when they signed on, and they did it anyway, because it mattered. And then when the war ended and they were told to go home, they went. No complaints. No, but I deserve this. So some women never flew again. They became wives and mothers. Some of them went back to being wives and mothers. A few of the wild cards went to Alaska, where a woman could still be a bush pilot without raising too many eyebrows, because it's Alaska, where the odds are good, but the goods are odd, as they say. And if you wanted to say, hey, if you're a lady in Alaska, that's the saying. But if you, and a few people, if you wanted to enter aviation, you could be a stewardess, which is, you might as well be in a hole in the bottom of the earth because you're so far from being a pilot. And don't get me started on stewardesses. There were charts on how to pluck your eyebrows. It's amazing what it took to be a stewardess. It's a whole other can of worms. I should write a book about that. So to me, it was a story that had to be told. And when I first started writing this book, there was not a lot of information out there. There were some books. There were the dusty old, a few memoirs. There's a great picture book called Yankee Doodle Girls. And there's some documentaries. There were a few things. But as it took me a couple of years to write the book, and then another year. It takes about a year from the time you turn in your final draft to the book being printed and put on shelves finally. And in that time, suddenly, there was a museum for the wasp. There's a museum in Sweetwater, Texas, which is where the Avenger Field is, where they trained. There was an exhibit at Arlington Cemetery in Washington. There's a big wasp exhibit. And the Women's University at Texas has a huge archive, and there's more and more information, but people still didn't know who these women were. And I would find myself traveling around like here and talking to people and going, guess what? And they'd go, really? I didn't know that. I'm glad to say that a year after Flygirl came out, although I can claim absolutely no responsibility for it, the United States government finally awarded these women the Congressional Medal of Honor. And so I don't know, there's about 80 surviving WASP, I think. And so they were invited to the Capitol building, and there was a ceremony, and I believe they got one medal to share. Or you probably buy a commemorative one made out of tin, because the economy is rough. But finally, they were being acknowledged. And I believe the civilian air pilots are finally next year. Next year, you get your Congressional Medal of Honor.
Called me, and they're going to let me know when I'm going down to Washington
to
receive the medal.
Good. You let us know how that goes. You make sure you get the medal. Don't share it with anybody. Just say, I did it. You say, hey guys, why don't we all put our names in a hat, because that worked the last time. I hope you get to at least get some pictures with it on, because it's well overdue. And some of the things you come across when you're researching a novel, you come across all sorts of things that you keep going, really? I didn't know that. Really, I didn't know that. So my book, and the thing that made it unique to me is for those of you that are not familiar with Flygirl, it is the story of a light-skinned black girl who passes for white in order to join the Women's Air Force Service pilots. And the reason for that is it was a Jim Crow army in 1942, and blacks and whites could not serve together. Now, when a woman named Nancy Love and another woman, Jackie Cochran, sort of developed the Women Air Force Service pilots, it was hugely controversial. And when Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love were willing to have minorities serve, but the military was like, are you crazy? We can't do that. We can't accommodate that. First of all, they didn't have facilities for women at any of these air bases. You had to stay at a hotel in a nearby town. And then to have a segregated thing, and everybody knew black people couldn't fly, but never mind the Tuskegee Airmen, or the guys that served in World War I, never mind them, you couldn't do it. And so there were women who were turned away. And I guess they accepted two Asian women who had flown for the Taiwanese Air Force. And there was rumors when I was doing my research of a Latina, one Latina who also served. So I mentioned that in my book because I couldn't find any information on her. I did find one of the Asian women, but I could not find the Latina. And after a certain point of looking at black and white photos, you're like, how will I know? I won't. And so a couple of years ago, the book has been out for a few years now, I got an email from a woman, and she said, I just read your book, and you mentioned a Latina, an unknown Latina. That was my mother. And she sent me a picture of her in her uniform, looking, I was just commenting to Ms. Dwyer here, I've seen in the little flyer, there's a flyer about Judith that's out front, and take a look at it. It's a great article about her flying, and you look so good in that uniform. And there's something about 1940s America, where people photographed really well, you dressed really well, and your makeup is impeccable, and you have perfect skin, and now it's like glamour shots. There's not, we don't look as good as you did. You guys did it well. But she sent me this beautiful picture of her mother, and it was so exciting that I felt like history was reaching back out to me and saying, like, we're still here. And her mother unfortunately had passed on, but I can't imagine what it would be like to be her kid and one day come across even a vague reference to your mother in someone's book. It would actually be creepy, but wonderful, right? You'd feel like somebody was paying attention. And now the world is paying more attention. There's so much more out there. So for my story, I was thinking about, okay, I could write just about the Women's Air Force service pilots. That makes sense to me. But I felt like I personally wanted to tell something more. And I thought about other underprivileged women. And I thought about my mother was born and raised in New Orleans and born in 1937, grew up there. And I thought about all the stories she used to tell about the challenges and the good things about growing up there, and that really struck me. And I said, okay, so the WASP were discriminated against for being women. Who else would have had to deal with that? African Americans. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to have an African American woman in this situation? Because then you can talk about everything.
Good evening. You just bear with me because I'm not used to making speeches, but I'm very glad to be here and tell you about when I was growing up. Amelia Earhart was my idol, and she was the best woman pilot, and I always wanted to fly. So during the war, I got an opportunity to join the Civil Air Patrol, and we had enough money in the Civil Air Patrol for 3 of us to take flying lessons. So they put all our names in a bag, and I was one of the 3. And I went up to Danbury every Saturday and Sunday for 2 years with 2 other girls. We didn't drive, we didn't have a car. We had a hitchhike from Norwalk all the way up to Danbury, but we did it. And so I flew every Saturday and Sunday for 2 years, and it was a wonderful experience. I loved flying. And after that, I was going steady with my boyfriend, got engaged and married, and he didn't want me to fly. So that was the end of my flying, but I enjoyed it very much. It was there was 30 girls in our unit, and we had a really good time together. And I enjoyed flying very much, and I still enjoyed it. In fact, my son for my birthday, took me to Stratford this year, and we flew for an hour all over the area, and it was wonderful. So I still like to fly.